Okay, listen, I understand that there are a little bit of problem with what I have been saying concerning the demand for a original Quran. And it may be that I'm asking for of Islam what I don't ask of my own Bible. And this came up in a number of your comments. Here's one. Jon Spoonfed said this. Jon Spoonfed Dean. Strange how they didn't preserve the early Bible nor the Quran. Is that because the books were not important or created at the time or the prophets? The messenger delivers the basic guidelines, and then hundreds of years later, politics jumps in and branding and develops books. YK made this point. My point is that you show 4th century AD Bibles the same way that there are 4th or 5th century AH, that means after Hijrah, Qurans. What you allude to is that since the cult of Muhammad is about 600 years younger than that of Christ, the later should be judged by higher standards. The later meaning the Islamic or the Quranic manuscript should be judged by a higher standard. Pub Lunch says it this way. An issue is that Jay says the New Testament written down within the lifetime of people who knew Jesus, yet the earliest manuscripts are from 300 years later. Isn't that the same as the oldest manuscripts for the Quran? Valid point. Absolutely. Valid point. The difficulty that most of you are coming up with is that you cannot really compare the two because we have completely two different categories. See, the earliest biblical manuscripts were written on papyrus. So what are papyrus? Well, let's take a look and see. You can see this picture of papyrus leaves. Those are papyrus leaves. And here I'm just going to show you what happens, what you do with the papyrus leaves. You can see this is an ancient example of in Egypt where the papyri were mostly came from and where they used to this for thousands of years. They would cut off the papyrus plant and then they would strip it down into strips which they would lay on a platform, then they would wet it, and then they would interweave it like a weaving mat, and then they would pound it out, and the sap from the papyrus leaves would interlock with each other, and that would create a flat surface, and then they would put a cover over top of it to hold it in place with weight, and then after a few days they would just take it off, and there you have your papyrus. It's very simple, nothing hard, and it's also very cheap. Anybody can make papyrus. And the oldest manuscripts or the oldest paper of the Bible was written on that. Why? Because it was a poor man's paper. Anybody could make it. All you need are papyrus stalks, and you can then understand why it was very simple then to make it, regardless of where you are, it was very simple to make it. So when you look around the world and you ask, well, where are these papyri? Here, let me give you some examples. So the earliest papyri for the Bible are John Rylands P52. Here's a picture of it. The John Rylands is from Manchester in England. It's from the 1st century. Some would say between 100 to 150. It's from the Gospel of John, chapter 18, verse 31 to 33, and also verses 37 to 38, front and back. Just a small fragment. Here's another one, Bodmer Papyrus, which is in Geneva. The Bodmer Papyrus, the P66, it's from 200 AD. It's housed there in Geneva in Rome, and it has fragments of the Gospel of Luke. Also, it has the Lord's Prayer, and it also has fragments of the Gospel of John from 200 AD. Here's another example, the Chester Beatty. Now, the Chester Beatty has many of these fragments. Here's one of P46, which is from the Pauline epistles. Many of the Pauline epistles are represented in these fragments from 200 AD again. There are 85 folios from the Chester Beatty fragments. And they are kept in Dublin, in Ireland, and also in the University of Michigan here in the United States. And the last one I'm going to show you here is Oxyrhynchus. The Oxyrhynchus fragments probably are of almost 41% of all biblical fragments, papyrus fragments, have been found there in Oxyrhynchus in Egypt, which is just outside of the city of Oxyrhynchus. It was in a pit used for rubbish. It was a rubbish pit, and they have come across these since the 1800s. I think only 1 to 2% of these have even yet been deciphered, because we're talking about millions of fragments, many of them just the size of a piece of cornflake. But here you can see the P1. This is one of the earliest that were found. It's from 200 AD. It's been dated 200 AD. It includes Matthew chapter 1, verses 1 to 9, and also verses 13 to 20 on the backside. And it's housed in the University of Pennsylvania. Papyrus, as you can see, when you look at these are very fragile. That's the problem with papyrus. Because they're made out of leaves, because that they're interlocking leaves, because they are hammered and then wetted and then dried and then used, after a while, they just start to disintegrate. They just become dry. If you're in a wet climate, they even disintegrate faster. If you're in a dry climate, they stay a little bit longer. In fact, one of the reasons why the papyrus that we have for the Dead Sea Scrolls lasted, well, those are from the 1st century BC. That's over 2,000 years they lasted, is because they were in a very dry climate in those jars there in the Dead Sea, just above the Dead Sea. But the biblical manuscripts, the New Testament manuscripts we're talking about, Dead Sea Scroll would be Old Testament. New Testament manuscripts, these fragments that you see are just that. They're just fragments. The reason why, because with papyrus, they disintegrate very quickly. They only last about 100 years before they start to disintegrate. So we would not expect to find any biblical manuscripts, complete ones, that have lasted 2,000 years. The ones that have lasted, and the fragments that have lasted, were thrown away, pieces that were thrown away. Remember, the Edict of Diocletian in 300 AD destroyed most of the biblical manuscripts that existed. They went around and just collected thousands upon tens of thousands of Bibles and just burned them. So we don't have full manuscripts anymore because of the Edict of Diocletian in 300 AD. That which we do have are ones that no one paid attention to, and because they are fragments, no one really cared about them, and that's why they still exist today, and that's why they're in different libraries all over the Western world. Papyri, by definition, is a poor man's paper. Disintegrates easily. Almost all of our earliest documents were written on papyri because the church was very poor. The church did not control anything. The church was under persecution for 300 years. Until the 4th century, the church was always under persecution, and being under persecution, they did not have the freedoms, nor did they have the wealth to be able to afford parchment. Parchment are not leaves. These have nothing to do with interlocking leaves. And so that's why you don't find parchments any earlier than the 4th century. Why the 4th century? Well, here's the Sinaiticus and the Alexandrinus and the Vaticanus that I've shown before. Vaticanus, Alexandrinus, and the Sinaiticus, or whichever way you want to put it them. But let's look at the Vaticanus and the Sinaiticus, the two on the left and in the center there. Those are the earliest of the full manuscripts. Now notice those are written on parchment. Parchment are animal skins. By definition, animal skins. Let's look and see what happens with parchment. When you look at parchment here you can see what you have to do. To make parchment is much, much more sophisticated, much, much more expensive. Here you see the skins are being dehaired. In order to dehair them, you've got to put them in a type of liquid made up of alkaline. And it takes days, sometimes weeks, to get all the hair off them. So that's the first problem. And then you have to dry them on frames. Here you can see skin drying. That's parchment, and they have to be pulled, and you have to keep them. And then you while they are drying there, you would rub them with stones to smooth out or get out all whatever hair is remaining. And then on the flesh side of the skin, which would be the inner side of the skin, you then would rub what we call pumice powder. And here you can see an example of pumice powder to make it much smoother. So this would take an enormous amount of labor, an enormous amount of work, and that's why only very wealthy individuals would be able to use or to take parchments. The Sinaiticus, this one here that you see in the middle, this one, the Sinaiticus, we know took about anywhere from 50 to 60 gazelle skins. This is deer skins. Anywhere from 50 to 60 gazelle skins had to be cured that way that I just showed you. It would take weeks, months, and you would then have to put them together to create the codice known as the Sinaiticus. Only someone very wealthy could afford something of that expensive. And that's why when Constantine, who was the emperor in the 4th century, when he converted to Christianity, when he commissioned the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, he commissioned, we understand, quite a number of these codices, these books, to be made of the New Testament, so that Athanasius could argue against Arius on whether or not Jesus was God. And so these books were commissioned at that time. This Sinaiticus and the Vaticanus, these two that you see here, are possibly two of those codices that were commissioned at that time. We don't know, because we don't know how many of them were finished. We just know that this is what the intent was. But those would have been commissioned by Constantine, who was very wealthy, being emperor of the entire empire at that time. He could therefore afford parchment. That's why it would be nothing for him to commission books written out of parchment. But that only began in the 4th century. So from the 4th century on, then, of course, parchment became very popular amongst the monks and, of course, amongst the church, which was very wealthy. We then come to the 7th century, and this is when Islam came to the fore. This is what we've been told. And what we're told is that immediately after the death of Muhammad in 632, you then get the first codex that was commissioned by a caliph. A caliph is a king. Caliph Abu Bakr between 632 and 634. So as a king who was there in Medina, according to the traditions, this is what the traditions tell us, he would have been wealthy, and he would have been able to, therefore, afford parchment. He would not need papyrus, and that's why when he commissioned Zayd ibn Thabit to write out the first Quran, that would have been on parchment. 20 years later, 652, when Uthman then has Zayd ibn Thabit again write a second Quran, that's known as the Uthmanic recension. By that time, he controlled all the way from Tripoli all the way to Afghanistan. All that land was under his control, according to the tradition. I'm always going to say that, according to the traditions. So he would have been enormously wealthy. He would have never used papyrus, and there's no reason for any caliph of his note to have used papyrus, so he would have used parchment again. So that earliest manuscript by Abu Bakr would have been in parchment. So would the one in 652. That would have been in parchment. And the 5 copies he made to the 5 cities would have all been on parchment. Some say, well, what about vellum? Vellum is actually another form. It's similar to parchment, but it comes from calves, much, much younger, and therefore they have much nicer, finer skin. And that's why they are very, very, very expensive. I don't know whether these were made on vellum. We're not told. What we are told is that these codices were created. And that's why the first Quran would have been written on these codices, written on parchment. What we do know is that the earliest manuscripts that have come down to us, that are still extant today, like the Topkapi, which is there in Istanbul, in the Topkapi Museum, like the Samarkand manuscript, which is in Tashkent in Uzbekistan, like the one that is in the British Library, the Matyal, the 2165 manuscript, or the Petropolitanus manuscript, which is in Paris, in France, or the Husseini manuscript, which is there in Cairo, in Egypt, or even the Sana'a manuscript, which was discovered in the 1970s there in Sana'a, in Yemen. All of these 6 major manuscripts, which are available. I have the Topkapi right here. That's it right up there. There's the Topkapi. The Topkapi, all of these would have been written and are written on parchment. They're not written on papyrus. They were all written on animal skins. Animal skins are durable. All of these manuscripts continue till today. The Sinaiticus, the Alexandrinus are still available. They're still pristine. You can go to the British Library, go to the Bridback Gallery, and you can see the Sinaiticus. It's almost as nice today as the day it was made, because it's made on animal skin. That's why the question I'm asking is perfectly relevant. Where are these 5 parchments of Uthman? 5 of them, sent to 5 different cities, written on animal skins, not on papyrus. You can't ask the same question of the earliest biblical manuscripts, because papyrus would have disintegrated within 100 years. That's why we only have little bits and bits and bits of fragments, but we have so many, tens of thousands of them, that we can piece them together. And by the 4th century then, when Constantine was able then to, with his will, to then commission these manuscripts like the Sinaiticus, the Vaticanus, Later on, the Alexandrinus, which comes in the 5th century, those are all written on parchment, on animal skin. If we could come up with 3 complete manuscripts of the New Testament by the 5th century, where in the world are these 5 manuscripts, parchment manuscripts, written by Uthman, commissioned by Uthman, and sent to 5 cities? I just want one. I just want one. So don't get upset with me when you think I'm actually not being consistent. I am being consistent, but you need to understand the technology that was used to create the earliest biblical script manuscripts did not include parchment. All they had, because they were poor, were papyrus. That excuse, Muslims, you can't make, because all of your manuscripts were created by caliphs, and none of them were created by poor people. They were all created by people who were enormously wealthy, and the earliest manuscripts we have today are all on parchment. Therefore, there is no excuse for you not to have these parchments today, because those parchments last for hundreds, thousands of years. Well, maybe I shouldn't say thousands, but at least we know that the ones that we have for the biblical manuscripts are now 1,700 years old, coming up onto 2,000 years. There are parchments that go all the way back. There are parchments in museums from Greek poetry that go right back to the time long before Christ, hundreds of years before Christ, and that's almost like 2,400 to 2,500 years ago, and they're still pristine today. You have no excuse not to have your parchments. Where are your parchments? That's all I'm asking. I would just like one of the 5. One of the 5. And please stop showing me the Topkapi or the Samarkand or the Ma'il or the Husseini. I don't want to look at those, because those are all 8th and 9th century. We haven't even got into the manuscript evidence. I don't want you to keep pushing those, or even the Birmingham folios, those two pages that you keep on throwing at me and say, listen, that shows that they're from the 7th century. We're going to confront all of that later on. But can you understand why I'm asking this question? Can you understand why I'm not being inconsistent? Can you now understand why the Muslims are so fearful? Because there's no excuse for them not to have these manuscripts. There's no excuse for them not being able to trace back this book. 1,700 years, that's not very long ago. Not for parchment, not for vellum. For papyrus, yes. So we would not expect to have the papyrus for our New Testament. Not today. You can't make that excuse. God bless you. This has been Jay. Over and out.